So when establishing the IMC budget, it's important to consider that there are 4 different sources of messages or marketing communications. The very first one is planned messages, and these are the media releases by the event. They are personal selling by the box office or the ticket agency. They are the advertisements made by the event and also the event's website. Then we have unplanned messages, and this includes the positive and negative impressions formed by the word of mouth. They are the media coverages that an event gets. It includes complaints made about an event by attendees or by other stakeholders like the local community perhaps. Then we have product messages, and these are all the information and all the details available about the event. So all the implied messages about the venue, about the program, the pricing, all of that are categorized under product messages. And finally, we have service messages, and that's the nature of contact with event staff or volunteers. It includes the quality of event transport and all the other support services. So it is important to consider that these 4 messages, these 4 different types of messages are relevant when considering to develop an IMC strategy. And knowing that these different types of messages exist, we should also be conscious that the event brand is shaped by more than just its planned promotional tools. A lot of the times the brand is influenced by other types of messages and other sources of marketing communications which are less controllable and manageable by the event organizers. And it's important to remember that. So, for example, under the unplanned messages, the PR, the public relation, or that an event gets, if something happens or there's an incident at an event, and we'll talk about this later, but if there's an incident at an event and it gets exposed in media, then obviously this impacts and affects the image of the event, and it impacts the brand of the event. So the event marketer should be conscious of all of these different types of messages and sources of marketing communication when they're trying to put together an IMC strategy. Now, we're talking about IMC. Obviously, allocating the most efficient amount of resources for an IMC plan is not an easy job. There's different ways that allocation of IMC budget can be done. Here we're going to discuss 4 different methods that is also relevant to events. The very first one is based on what the event can afford. Now, it's a top-down approach, meaning that usually it's based on whatever resources the event has or whatever resources is available to the event organizers in order to produce the event, and based on that they put aside an amount which obviously they can afford, and they allocate that for its IMC or for its marketing communication purposes. Usually this is used by smaller events, smaller community events, and amateur sport events. And the reason it's top-down is because the board or the top management, they set a spending limit, and then the event marketer or whoever is in charge of the marketing communication then tries to construct an IMC plan based on that limited resource, and they try to achieve the marketing objectives of the event using those resources. The second method of establishing an IMC budget is called the percentage of sales method. Now, this is usually based on projecting and forecasting what the sales are going to be, and then putting aside and allocating a certain percentage of that forecast revenue. So in terms of an event, it could be that it is forecasted that the sales from tickets and merchandise purchase is going to be a certain number, a certain figure, and then a percentage of that figure, say for example 10% or 15% of that forecast is going to be allocated to IMC. Now the advantage is obviously it provides more stability, because the resources that are allocated to promotion and communication is in accordance with the revenue and with the return. However, the main drawback of this method is that it is based on a false premise that sales cause promotion, whereas we know that this is not true, and it's basically the promotion causes sales. So it's how you promote and the way you promote your event that can cause and lead into more sales rather than the other way around. So we can argue that it's based on a false premise, and therefore it might not be accurate. The third method is called the competitive parity method. Now here the budget is based on what other events do and how much they spend on their promotion. So you look at other similar events and you identify how much they spend on their promotion, and then you use that as a basis of allocating budget for your event's IMC. Now here it's adhering to the collective wisdom of the sector. So knowing that the sector or the majority of events, similar events, have certain amount allocated to their IMC, and using that as the basis of the budget allocated to our events IMC is how this method, what this method is about. But remembering that there is a risk that the collective wisdom of the sector might not necessarily be always accurate, and also remembering that different events have various characteristics, and therefore they might require different IMC resources. So again, this method might not necessarily be accurate. Finally, the last method is called objectives and task method, and this is probably the most accurate out of all four methods. And in here, it's based on a process. First, you establish what your IMC objectives are. Then you determine specific tasks which will help you achieve those IMC objectives. And then you will calculate what the costs of those tasks are, and by adding all of those numbers, then obviously you have an estimate budget for your IMC. Now I'm going to take you through an example of how this last method, the objectives and task method, can be used in the context of an event. So let's look at an example of a community festival and how the objectives and task budget setting can be used within this festival. So as I said, the very first stage is that you have to establish your IMC objectives. In this particular case, for this particular community festival, the IMC objective was that every household in the community should receive information about the festival at least 3 times. So we can say that the reach of this objective is that all community households living within that premises should be receiving this information, and the frequency is that they should be receiving it 3 times during the duration of the festival. Now that's the objective. Now in order to meet that objective, let's see what tasks are required to help us to achieve the objective. So number 1, letterbox drop of flyer done by volunteers. So to achieve that reach and frequency, we have to have letterbox drop of flyers. So we'll recruit volunteers who can drop flyers off in letterboxes. Then we will also have advertisements in local newspapers. So, for example, Coast Daily, which is also the event sponsor, we could have 3/4 of a page allocated to advertising the event in that local newspaper. A third task that we could consider, which could help us achieve our objective, is to have 3 different stories in the local newspaper about the different aspects of the event. So we have to make sure that this local newspaper, which is also the event sponsor, has at least 3 different stories about the event in its newspaper, and that's the publicity that the event can get. Now these are the tasks. The next stage is to see and calculate what the costs would be in relation to undertaking these tasks. Having volunteers drop off flyers in letterboxes, so that the cost in relation to that is printing 3,000 single-page double-sided flyers. And obviously we're using volunteers, so there's no costs incurred in terms of payments to volunteers, but the cost of printing these flyers would be around $1,000. The next task was in terms of having advertisement in a local newspaper, and the cost in relation to that would be around $1,500. And remembering that because they're one of the sponsors of the event, the event could actually make use of a reduced sponsorship rate. And the third one was having 3 stories published by the local newspaper about the event, and that doesn't incur any costs for the event. Very final stage is calculating the IMC budget, which is done through adding up the costs related to each task. So 1,000 plus 1,500, that gives us 2,500. That would be the cost of undertaking the tasks, which will help us achieve the objective that we had in mind. Therefore, we can conclude that the IMC budget for this community festival would be around 3,500. So as you can see, this is a very practical method of identifying a budget and resources for IMC and for promotion of an event. Now, before we move on to the next section, I'd like to briefly discuss a case study about Scotland Island Festival. Now, Scotland Island is located in Pittwater, in the far north of Sydney. It has around 1,000 people living on the island, and there are 350 houses. The island has a kindergarten, and it has a community hall, which is set in a community park. Because the island is very tranquil and it's very quiet, it usually attracts a number of people, artists and talented people. So writers, photographers, singers, musicians, sculptors, all of these creative people usually tend to travel to this island because of the quality, the tranquility and that it has. So within this festival, the promotional objective that the festival had was to reach the target market. And the target market, I have to mention, are the residents of the northern beaches of Sydney interested in artistic activities. So they wanted to reach this particular target market at least 3 times. And remembering that this promotion objective was in line with the overall objective of the festival of attracting about 3,000 attendees. Now, the festival had various tactics, so they employed various tactics in order to achieve this particular objective that they had in mind. These tactics included the use of an interactive website, having 5,000 festival programs printed by a sponsor and distributed in the market area by volunteers. They also had about 1,000 flyers for each of the programs, printed out and distributed. They had 300 posters placed in businesses and community center in the Pittwater area, And they also had publicity about the event, so any press releases in the local media about the event. So these were the different tactics that they had. And I have to also mention here that the event used the objective and task method in order to identify its budget. So they knew the objective, they knew the tasks that were required in order to achieve that objective, and we have them here on their tactics. And then what they did is they set aside or they identified the costs in relation to each of these tasks, and they set aside a budget accordingly. Now, the IMC campaign for this event was successful because it did manage to achieve the objective that it had in mind. So the event did end up having about 3,000 attendees, which was obviously the objective of the festival, and that's why we can argue that the IMC campaign was successful. Okay. In the next part, I'll be talking about the different elements of IMC. So these different elements include advertising, public relations, sales promotion, direct marketing, online presence, and personal selling. Online presence, specifically because of its importance and its relevance to events, will be discussed next week. We will have a guest speaker as well who will talk about their use of online promotional tools, but we'll cover the others today in the next segment.